There is an old, unspoken truth. When a mind sees too far, the world grows uneasy. People admire genius from a distance, in books, in history, in outcomes polished by time. But up close, brilliance is unsettling. It disrupts. It questions. It refuses to inherit the limits that others quietly agreed upon. And so society doesn't confront genius directly. It shapes it, smooths its edges, tames its questions, not through violence, but through 1,000 small pressures designed to make the extraordinary feel unreasonable. Genius is rarely destroyed. More often, it is conditioned, led away from its own nature until it forgets the depth it once trusted. This is the story of why society manipulates those who think differently, and what is lost along the way.
Genius does not begin with achievement. It begins with awareness, a quiet noticing that the world feels slightly tilted, slightly out of sync with the way your mind moves. For a child with an unusual mind, difference arrives long before language. They see meanings in small things, patterns in silence, truths between words. They wonder about what others ignore and feel emotions that arrive too sharply, too quickly, too deeply. Not because they choose to, but because their mind is wired to experience the world in high resolution. At first, this difference feels natural, unquestioned, a private harmony that no one else needs to understand. But society notices before the child does. A teacher pauses, confused by a question that feels too adult. A parent tells them to stop overthinking. Classmates stare when they drift into inner worlds that don't match the pace of the room. This is the first fracture. Not loud, not cruel, just a moment, subtle enough to miss, when the child realizes they are being viewed through a different lens. What the world sees as unusual, the child experiences as simply real. But recognition is a mirror, and once the mind sees that others react with discomfort, curiosity, or distance, it learns something crucial. Being fully oneself comes with a cost. So the child begins to shrink small parts of themselves, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Every organism adapts to survive, and the human mind is no different. They learn when to speak and when to stay silent, when to share an idea and when to hide it behind a softer, more digestible version, when to reveal their depth and when to wear the mask of simplicity. The fracture widens gradually. By adolescence, they feel it fully. A quiet disconnection from conversations that feel shallow, rules that feel arbitrary, and expectations shaped for people who never asked the same questions they did. They begin sensing something else too, that their brightness makes others uncomfortable. Not because it is threatening, but because it reflects back everything others would rather not confront, their fears, their doubts, their unquestioned truths. And so society begins to send signals. Don't think too much. You're too sensitive. Why are you like this? Just be normal. Stop asking why. These messages do not attack intelligence. They attack the expression of it. Slowly, the gifted mind realizes that its natural state, its curiosity, its intuition, its complexity, doesn't align with the world around it. This is how genius learns to dim. Not from rejection, but from the subtle emotional cost of being authentic. Every fracture reshapes them, a shift in posture, a quieter voice, a delayed question, a softened thought. They do not break, they bend, and bending becomes a habit. But beneath the surface, something remains untouched, a silent awareness that their mind was meant for a landscape wider than the one they were handed. This untouched part will become important later, but for now, the story lives in the fracture. The moment difference becomes a burden, and the first thread of manipulation quietly weaves itself into identity.
If genius begins with difference, conditioning begins with fear. Not the dramatic fear that makes headlines, but the quiet, invisible fear that shapes social behavior. Fear of unpredictability, fear of deviation, fear of minds that move outside the established map. Families, schools, and cultural systems rarely set out to manipulate brilliant minds. They simply attempt to make them manageable. A gifted child questions rules that were built to be followed, not examined. They challenge beliefs others cling to for stability. They ask why when everyone else has already accepted because. And questioning disrupts order, so the shaping begins early. Families, overwhelmed by the intensity of a child's inner world, instinctively encourage conformity. Parents who grew up suppressing their own depth cannot hold space for a child who reflects everything they buried. Thus, instead of nurturing the mind's expansion, they subtly steer it toward familiarity. Don't say things like that. You think too deeply for your age. That's not how the world works. You need to stop being so sensitive. These statements are not meant to wound. They're meant to protect. But protection becomes limitation. In school, the same pattern repeats. Systems built for average pace and standardized thinking cannot absorb the intensity of divergence. The child who thinks faster is told to wait. The child who thinks differently is told to follow instructions. The child whose intuition leaps ahead is told to show their work. Not because the system dislikes genius, but because it is designed to maintain uniformity. What cannot be standardized gets suppressed. Over time, the young mind receives a consistent message. Your natural way of thinking is too much for this environment. By adolescence, the conditioning deepens. Peers reinforce social norms with precision sharper than any adult. Anything that sits outside the accepted mold, emotional depth, intellectual intensity, unusual interests, becomes a target for teasing or exclusion. So the brilliant mind adapts again. They hide their intelligence behind humor. They pretend not to understand concepts that come effortlessly. They play along, practicing emotional camouflage to avoid becoming a spectacle.
This is manipulation disguised as normalcy. No one says, diminish your brilliance, but everything whispers it. To understand the root cause, one must look deeper. Society relies on predictability. Predictability brings stability, and stability resists anything that threatens its structure. Genius does not threaten through rebellion. It threatens through insight. Insight reveals cracks in systems others depend on to feel safe. So society does what every organism does when encountering something it cannot control. It neutralizes it. Not with force, with shaping, with encouragement to fit in, with praise given only when the gifted child acts like everyone else, with silence when they express too much depth. This conditioning is not a moment. It is a slow erosion, a gentle push away from authenticity and toward palatable predictability. By adulthood, many gifted people no longer recognize where the conditioning begins and their identity ends. They become exceptional at everything, except being themselves. This is the true cost of early manipulation, not the suppression of intelligence, but the redirection of genius into roles the world finds comfortable. Yet beneath it all, something remains untouched. The seed of a mind that once questioned freely, waiting for the moment it begins to remember itself again.
To understand why society manipulates genius minds, one must understand their inner mechanics. Genius is not simply high IQ or advanced skill. It is a constellation of traits, neurological, emotional, perceptual, that create a high sensitivity, high processing mind. These traits overlap in 3 core areas. 1. Cognitive intensity. Gifted minds process information rapidly and in layers. Where most people see one idea, they see 10. Where others see a rule, they see its exceptions. Where someone sees coincidence, they see pattern. Their brains are wired for divergent thinking, rapid association, long-range abstraction, intuitive leaps, and deep integration of experience. This makes them excellent thinkers, but also difficult to predict. 2. Emotional depth. Contrary to stereotypes, genius is not cold or detached. It feels intensely. Studies on gifted individuals show heightened emotional reactivity, increased empathy, and a lower threshold for sensing tension or inconsistency. Their nervous system registers subtleties others overlook. To society, this looks like overreacting, but internally, it is simply accurate perception at high resolution. 3. Perceptual overexcitability. Genius minds are rarely passive observers. They absorb, they question, they challenge, they imagine alternatives. This can appear rebellious, but it is simply neurological divergence expressing itself. These traits create brilliance and also misunderstanding. A mind that processes quickly can appear arrogant. A mind that feels deeply can appear fragile. A mind that speaks truthfully can appear abrasive. A mind that questions can appear defiant. But these interpretations are social reactions, not psychological truths. What society misreads as personality flaws are often side effects of advanced cognitive functioning. Restlessness,
is mental overflow. Introversion is sensory regulation. Sensitivity is emotional accuracy. Intensity is passion without dilution. Nonconformity is independent thinking. Yet social systems are not designed to interpret these traits correctly. They are built around averages, around predictability and shared pace. When someone moves faster, deeper, or differently, systems respond by trying to slow them down or fit them in. This is where misinterpretation becomes manipulation. Why society feels threatened. Psychologically, humans depend on social cohesion. Anything that disrupts group norms, even unintentionally, creates anxiety. A person who sees through illusions threatens the comfort illusions provide. A person whose intelligence exposes inefficiency threatens the security inefficiency offers. A person whose depth reveals superficiality threatens the ease superficiality protects. Thus, society responds by attempting to contain the mind that makes others feel transparent. And containment is disguised as correction. You're thinking too much. Why can't you be like everyone else? That's not realistic. Every one of these statements is an emotional request. Please stop making me uncomfortable. The psychological truth is simple. People don't fear genius. They fear what genius reveals. But revealing is not a choice for a gifted mind. It is its nature. And nature can only be suppressed for so long before it begins to fracture or awaken. By adulthood, gifted minds become experts at hiding themselves. Not because they want to, but because they have been trained by family, peers, institutions, and subtle emotional punishment to soften their intensity in order to remain connected. Connection becomes conditional. Be brilliant, but not too brilliant. Be insightful, but not disruptive. Be creative, but stay inside the lines. Be yourself, but only the parts we can understand. So they learn the art of emotional masking. They mimic social patterns. They speak in simplified versions of their thoughts. They pretend they don't notice inconsistencies, contradictions, hypocrisies. They smile through boredom. They nod through shallow conversations. They suppress questions that feel too heavy. This suppression is not passive. It is exhausting. Inside, a quiet resistance begins to form, a war between authenticity and acceptance. The mind wants to express itself fully, but the world has taught it that authenticity comes with social penalties. So, the gifted person lives in tension, feeling too much, but pretending to feel less, understanding too deeply, but speaking gently, seeing the truth, but staying silent, craving intellectual intimacy, but settling for emotional caution. This is not rebellion, it is survival. But survival has a cost: self-abandonment. The gifted person becomes what others need them to be, a translator between their own complexity and the world's simplicity, a bridge that never gets crossed, a lighthouse no one looks toward, a mirror others use without ever seeing the one holding it. The inner conflict deepens. Do I reveal myself and lose connection? Do I hide myself and lose identity? This is the silent resistance, the psychological split between belonging and authenticity. It manifests in subtle ways: feeling drained after social interaction, difficulty forming deep connections, a sense of being fundamentally unseen, oscillation between confidence and self-doubt, creative urges that never fully surface, emotional exhaustion from constant self-editing. The tragedy is not that society misunderstands them. It's that they begin to misunderstand themselves. Years of shaping and softening erode clarity. They start doubting their instincts, questioning their perceptions, apologizing for their depth, using intelligence to rationalize staying small. But the resistance never disappears. It waits, quietly, patiently, for a moment when the mind becomes too tired to keep pretending. That moment marks the beginning of the turning point.
The breaking point is rarely ended with drama. More often, it comes quietly, during a conversation that feels too shallow, a job that demands conformity, a relationship where emotional depth becomes a liability. Something small triggers something enormous. A comment, a dismissal, a silence. A moment when the gifted mind suddenly sees with painful clarity how much of itself it has abandoned just to remain acceptable. This clarity is devastating because it reveals the truth behind years of discomfort. Society did not misunderstand them, it shaped them for its own convenience. The realization comes in layers. Layer 1, anger. Not loud anger, inner anger. A recognition of the manipulation, how brilliance was softened, how depth was reframed as flaw, how authenticity was labeled too much. It is anger toward systems that demanded conformity, toward people who praised their potential while pressuring them to shrink, toward a world that values genius only after it is dead and safely turned into inspiration. Layer 2, grief. Grief for the self they abandoned, for the years spent performing, for the thoughts they never voiced, for the friendships built on versions of themselves that were incomplete. This grief is not self-pity, it is recognition, it is mourning. It is the first honest emotion they have allowed themselves in years. Layer 3, clarity. Something recalibrates. They start seeing patterns they once tolerated. How people depend on their insight but resent their truth. How society praises innovation while punishing deviation. How intelligence is celebrated only when it conforms. This clarity is not enlightenment, it is awakening. A shift from "what's wrong with me" to "why did I ever believe I had to dim myself?" Layer 4, rejection of the mask. The gifted mind reaches a point where hiding becomes too heavy to carry. The mask that protected them becomes suffocating. The social roles that earned acceptance now feel like imprisonment. And so the mind begins to shed, carefully, cautiously, but inevitably. They start speaking more honestly, thinking more freely, questioning without apology, protecting their depth instead of explaining it. Some relationships fade, some systems reject them, some people call them changed when, in truth, they are simply becoming visible. This is not rebellion, this is return.
Return to the mind they had before conditioning began. Return to the questions that once felt natural. Return to the clarity they abandoned to belong. The breaking point is not an ending. It is the beginning of intellectual and emotional sovereignty. A shift from manipulated self to reclaimed self. From conditioned identity to authentic identity. From survival to truth. And once this awakening has begun, the mind cannot return to its old shape.
Healing for a gifted mind is not about becoming better. It is about becoming real again. The process begins quietly with a single internal question. What if my mind was never the problem? This question breaks old narratives. It softens the years of self-blame. It restores the right to exist without apology. Reclaiming the inner voice does not mean speaking louder. It means speaking truthfully. It means recognizing that sensitivity is not fragility, that depth is not dysfunction, that intensity is not immaturity. It means understanding that brilliance is not a threat except to systems built on mediocrity. As the mind reclaims itself, 3 shifts occur. 1. Boundaries form naturally. The gifted person begins refusing environments that drain them, not aggressively, but silently. They step away from conversations that insult their intelligence, relationships that demand emotional masking, and systems that mistake obedience for competence. They stop explaining their depth. They stop apologizing for their curiosity. They stop translating themselves into smaller versions. Boundaries become a form of truth-telling. 2. Authentic thinking emerges. Thoughts that were once softened now return in full clarity. Ideas long suppressed begin resurfacing. Uncomfortable ones, honest ones, revolutionary ones. They rediscover the pleasure of thinking without monitoring themselves, the joy of intellectual solitude, the freedom of questioning without fearing consequences. This return to original thinking is not regression, it is integration. The mind becomes whole again. 3. Emotional integration deepens. Gifted minds feel intensely because they perceive intensely. And healing means allowing these emotions to exist without judgment. They begin understanding that loneliness was not defect, it was misplacement. That dissatisfaction was not negativity, it was misalignment. That emotional overwhelm was not weakness, it was unfiltered perception. Integration creates emotional clarity. I feel this because I see more. I hurt because I understand. I struggle because I refuse to lie to myself. This clarity becomes grounding. As the inner voice strengthens, the person becomes more themselves than they've been in years. Not more dramatic, not more extreme, just more aligned. They become selective with their energy, precise with their truth, comfortable with solitude, disinterested in validation. This is not isolation, it is liberation. They begin building a life that fits their mind, not a life they were pressured into. They seek people who value depth. They create environments that allow complexity. They choose paths that honor their natural intelligence. Healing is not the end of manipulation. It is the refusal to participate in it.
Genius minds often end where they began, in solitude. Not loneliness, solitude. The quiet space where their thoughts can breathe without shrinking, where their depth is not judged, where their intuition can return to its original pace. The world taught them to hide, to soften, to conform. But solitude teaches them to listen again. In solitude, the mind remembers its shape. It hears its own questions with clarity. It feels its emotions without dilution. It renews its sensitivity as strength rather than burden. Solitude becomes sanctuary, the only place untouched by society's conditioning. Here, the gifted mind realizes something profound. They were never meant to fit into the world as it is. They were meant to illuminate what it could be. Their role was never to conform to the pace of others, but to offer a new rhythm. Never to mirror the world's limitations, but to reflect its possibilities. The manipulations they endured, the shaping, the dimming, the softening, did not erase their brilliance. They simply delayed it. And now, standing in the quiet of their reclaimed mind, they understand the deeper truth. Genius is not a threat, it is a light. But light unsettles those who live in shadows. So society tries to control the source instead of expanding its own vision. Yet no amount of shaping can extinguish a mind built to see differently. The gifted person learns to walk with a new kind of confidence, not loud, not performative, but grounded. They do not crave approval. They do not fear misunderstanding. They do not dilute their insight to protect others from discomfort. They have returned to the truth of themselves, and that return is the quiet revolution society never anticipates. Because a mind that can no longer be manipulated is a mind that becomes uncontainable, not through rebellion, but through authenticity. The story ends where it began, with difference. But now that difference is no longer fracture, it is foundation. A place the gifted mind finally stands without bending. A place where society cannot reshape them, only witness them. A place where the mind becomes what it was always meant to be, undimmed, unapologetic, and free.